The neon lights of the drive-through menu board cast an unnatural glow across Brian Mitchell's face as he squinted through his car windshield. It was nearly midnight, but the line of cars snaked around the corner of the fast food restaurant, a testament to America's perpetual hunger. At 25, Brian had perfected his order without needing to glance at the menu: double bacon cheeseburger, large fries, onion rings, and a chocolate shake. The total would come to $14.79, and the calories would push well past 2,000, just for this fourth meal of his day. The usual Brian? The drive-through attendant recognized him, which should have been a warning sign. Instead, it felt like affirmation. "You know it, Darla." He flashed his trademark grin, the one that had made him popular since high school, the one that disguised how exhausted he really felt lately. As Brian pulled into a parking spot to eat, his phone buzzed with notifications from his friends. Another party this weekend. Another chance to be the fun guy, the life of the gathering, the one who always brought extra beer and knew the best late-night food spots. At 285 pounds, Brian had mastered the art of being the big funny guy. His size had become part of his identity, his personality, a shield that deflected attention from the growing emptiness he felt. Back in his small apartment, Brian caught a glimpse of himself in the hallway mirror. His XXXL Chicago Bears t-shirt stretched across his frame, and his face looked puffy even to his own forgiving eyes. "Just genetics," he muttered, repeating what he'd told himself for years. His father was big. His uncles were big. This was just the Mitchell way. The next morning arrived with the familiar sense of lethargy that had become Brian's constant companion. His job as a sales representative for a local beverage distributor kept him on the road, visiting convenience stores and restaurants, places where free samples and lunch meetings were occupational hazards. By noon, he was already at his third gas station coffee, paired with a packaged honey bun that left a film of grease on his fingers. The persistent thirst had started 3 weeks ago. No matter how many sodas or sports drinks he consumed, his mouth remained desert dry. Then came the frequent bathroom trips, disrupting his sales calls and driving routes. When dizziness hit him during a presentation to a potential new client, Brian had laughed it off as low blood sugar and grabbed another donut from the conference room spread. It was his mother's concerned voice on his weekly Sunday call that finally pushed him to see a doctor. "You don't sound right, Brian. You sound tired all the time now." "I'm fine, Mom. Just busy season at work." But even as he said it, he knew something was wrong. The unexplained weight loss, 10 pounds in 2 weeks despite eating more than ever, should have been a victory, but somehow felt ominous. The waiting room at the clinic was painted an institutional beige that reminded Brian of school cafeterias and government offices. The magazines were outdated, and a muted TV displayed a cooking show where impossibly fit hosts prepared guilt-free desserts. Brian scrolled through his phone instead, responding to his group chat, where friends were planning the upcoming weekend. "Brian Mitchell?" The nurse called his name with practiced neutrality. The examination was quick but thorough. Blood pressure elevated, weight 285 pounds, BMI 38.7, severe obesity. The doctor, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes behind stylish glasses, ordered blood tests and asked pointed questions about his family history, his thirst, his fatigue. 3 days later, Brian sat stunned in the same doctor's office as she explained his test results. His blood glucose was 278 mmHg DL, well above the 200 that indicated diabetes. His A1C, measuring his average blood sugar over months, was 9.2%, far beyond the 6.5% threshold for diagnosis. "Type 2 diabetes," the doctor said, her voice steady but gentle. "Your pancreas isn't producing enough insulin, or your body isn't using it effectively. At your age, with your weight and lifestyle, it's becoming more common, but it's still serious." Brian heard fragments of her continued explanation through the ringing in his ears. Complications, kidney damage, vision problems, nerve damage, heart disease, stroke. "This isn't a death sentence, Brian. she continued, noticing his blanched face. "But it is a wake-up call. You need to make significant changes." The prescription for metformin felt heavy in his pocket as he walked to his car. The glucose monitor kit in his bag seemed to announce his new identity to the world: diabetic at 25. The nutrition referral slip mocked his lifetime of food choices. The recommended 140-pound weight loss target, nearly half his current body weight, felt as impossible as climbing Everest without oxygen. That night, alone in his apartment, Brian ordered pizza, his habitual response to stress. But as he reached for the third slice, something unfamiliar stirred within him. Not the physical fullness he typically ignored, but a new awareness. Each bite now carried consequences beyond the momentary pleasure. Each swallow pushed him further from health, from longevity, from the life he suddenly realized he wanted. For the first time in years, Brian left food unfinished on his plate. He walked to his bathroom and stood on the scale, 285 pounds. He looked at himself in the mirror, really looked, beyond the practiced smile and the carefully cultivated persona of the fun, carefree guy. "This isn't who I want to be anymore," he whispered to his reflection. The words hung in the air, both terrifying and liberating. His phone buzzed again. The group chat was finalizing weekend plans at their favorite sports bar: wings, pitchers of beer, and watching the game. Brian's thumbs hovered over the keyboard. For the first time since college, he typed, "Count me out this time, guys," not feeling it. The response was immediate, a barrage of protest, jokes about him getting old, accusations of having secretly started dating someone. Brian set the phone down without responding. Tomorrow would be day one of a journey he couldn't yet imagine completing. But for tonight, just saying no to one small destructive habit felt like the first tentative step on a very long road. 6 weeks into his diagnosis, Brian sat in his car outside the gym, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened. Through the large windows, he could see people, fit, confident people, moving with purpose between exercise machines. His new gym membership card sat on the passenger seat, alongside the logbook where he'd been diligently recording his blood glucose readings. The first month after diagnosis had been a chaotic education in a world he'd never given much thought to. Carbohydrate counting, medication timing, reading nutrition labels like they were complex legal documents. His kitchen, once a wasteland of takeout containers and frozen meals, now contained unfamiliar items: measuring cups, a food scale, vegetables that weren't potatoes. His endocrinologist had been clear: medication alone wouldn't be enough. Exercise was non-negotiable. Brian had nodded during the appointment, as if walking into a gym wasn't akin to entering a foreign country without speaking the language. "Just go in, man," he muttered to himself, finally reaching for the door handle. "Nobody's looking at you." But it felt like everyone was looking as he awkwardly made his way to the treadmill section, hyper-aware of how his t-shirt clung to his large frame. He'd already lost 20 pounds through diet changes alone, mostly water weight, his nutritionist had explained, but at 265 he still felt conspicuously out of place. 15 minutes into his walk, sweat pouring down his face, a voice beside him nearly made him stumble. "First time's the hardest." Brian glanced over to see a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair on the neighboring treadmill. Unlike the 20-something fitness models Brian had been intimidated by, this man carried some extra weight around his middle and breathed heavily as he walked. "That obvious, huh?" Brian managed between labored breaths. "Was in your shoes 3 years ago." The man tapped the medical alert bracelet on his wrist. "Diabetes diagnosis at 48. Doctor said change or die, basically." Something about the man's matter-of-fact tone cut through Brian's isolation. "How'd you do it?" "One day at a time. Some better than others." He extended his hand. "Mike Harrington." That chance encounter evolved into an unexpected friendship. Mike, a high school history teacher and divorced father of 2, became Brian's unofficial guide to navigating life with diabetes. Their post-workout coffee sessions, black coffee, no sugar, a taste Brian was reluctantly acquiring, became a lifeline. "My friends don't get it," Brian confessed one morning, 3 months into his journey, now down 35 pounds. "They still invite me to pizza and beer nights, like I'm being difficult on purpose." Mike nodded knowingly. "People fear what challenges their own habits. Your change holds up a mirror they're not ready to look into." The hardest blow came when Brian declined a weekend trip to New Orleans with his college buddies, a trip centered entirely around drinking and eating. His best friend Tyler's response had stung. "Dude, you can cheat on your diet for one weekend. When did you get so boring?" "I'm not dieting," Brian had tried to explain. "I'm trying not to die young." The conversation had ended awkwardly, leaving Brian feeling isolated in his struggle. That night, standing in his kitchen, the loneliness had nearly driven him to order his old comfort foods. Instead, he'd called Mike, who talked him through the craving until it passed. Work presented its own challenges. Client lunches, once centered around burgers and fries, now required careful navigation. Some clients respected his choices, others seemed personally offended when he declined certain foods or alcoholic drinks. His boss had pulled him aside after he'd lost 40 pounds. "You're looking good, Mitchell, but don't let this health kick distract you from your numbers." Brian had smiled tightly, not bothering to explain that this health kick was actually keeping him alive. His sales numbers hadn't suffered. If anything, his newfound energy had improved his performance. But the comment revealed how others perceived his transformation as a phase, a vanity project, rather than a necessary medical intervention. By the 6-month mark, Brian's body had changed dramatically. Down 75 pounds, his face had emerged from the puffiness, revealing cheekbones he hadn't seen since high school. His blood glucose readings had stabilized, and his endocrinologist had reduced his medication dosage, expressing cautious optimism about his progress. But the internal changes were even more profound. The brain fog that had clouded his thinking for years had lifted. The afternoon energy crashes that he'd attributed to normal workday fatigue had disappeared. Even his sleep, once fitful and never refreshing, had deepened and restored him. One Saturday morning, Brian achieved something he hadn't thought possible. He ran a full mile without stopping, bent over, hands on his knees, gulping air at the track's 1-mile marker. He felt tears spring to his eyes, not from pain, but from a complex emotion he couldn't immediately name. Pride, perhaps, or grief for the years spent believing he wasn't capable of such a basic human function. That evening, scrolling through his phone, Brian paused on an old photo from just 7 months earlier. The image showed him at a Super Bowl party, surrounded by friends, a plate piled high with wings and nachos balanced on his lap, beer in hand. His smile in the photo didn't reach his eyes, which carried a dullness he now recognized as chronic unwellness. The contrast with his current state, sitting on his balcony with a grilled chicken salad, planning his first 5K charity run, struck him profoundly. He was halfway to his weight loss goal, but in many ways he felt like a completely different person already. When his phone rang with Tyler's name on the screen, Brian hesitated before answering. "Hey, man," Tyler's voice sounded tentative. "Been a while." "Yeah," Brian agreed, unsure where this was heading. "Look, I was an ass about New Orleans." The admission surprised Brian. "Mike posted that picture of you guys after your run today, and you look happy, man. Happier than I've seen you in years." The conversation that followed was the first honest one they'd had since college, about health, about growing up, about the easy patterns that had defined their friendship for too long. "I miss you," Tyler said finally. "But I get it now. This isn't just a diet. It's my life," Brian replied simply. "I'm trying to have one that lasts." As they hung up, Brian realized the emotion he'd felt at the track wasn't just pride or grief, it was freedom. Freedom from the prison his body had become, and from the identity he'd constructed to cope with his slow self-destruction. At the halfway point of his journey, the road ahead remained long and uncertain. But for the first time, Brian believed he might actually reach the end of it. The fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor buzzed overhead as Brian paced anxiously, his phone pressed to his ear. 10 months into his transformation, down 110 pounds, he was facing a crisis that had nothing to do with his own health. "They're saying it's a minor heart attack, Mum," he explained, his voice tight with worry. "Dad's stable, but they want to run more tests." His father, Robert Mitchell, had collapsed while mowing the lawn. A man who, at 58, shared all the characteristics that had once defined Brian. The robust appetite, the dismissal of medical advice, the stubborn insistence that health problems were simply the price of enjoying life. "I'm booking a flight now," Brian assured his mother. "I'll be there tomorrow." Returning to his childhood home in rural Pennsylvania after nearly a year of minimal contact felt like stepping into a time capsule. The refrigerator still overflowed with processed foods. The cabinets remained stocked with the sugary cereals and snacks he'd grown up on. His mother's solution to stress was still baking. The house smelled of fresh chocolate chip cookies when he arrived. "You're so thin," his mother exclaimed, pulling back from their embrace to examine him. At 175 pounds, Brian wasn't thin by conventional standards, but compared to his former self, the change was dramatic. At the hospital, his father's reaction was less enthusiastic. "You look like you're wasting away," Robert commented from his bed, surrounded by monitoring equipment. "Your mother says you don't even eat bread anymore." Brian swallowed the defensive response that rose in his throat. "I eat differently now, Dad. It's keeping me alive." The cardiologist's assessment was blunt. Robert needed significant lifestyle changes or faced a much more serious cardiac event in the near future. As the doctor outlined a diet and exercise plan, Brian watched his father's expression shift from dismissal to anger to, finally, fear. Later, alone in the hospital room while his mother fetched coffee, Robert turned to his son with uncharacteristic vulnerability. "I don't know how to live differently, Brian. I've been this way for 40 years. The admission cracked something open between them. "I didn't either, Dad, but I learned. And if I can, anyone can." What had originally been planned as a weekend visit extended into 2 weeks. Brian worked remotely from his parents' dining room table, and each evening he taught his father what he'd learned through his own journey: how to read nutrition labels, how to find movement that didn't feel like punishment, how to recognize hunger versus emotional eating. His mother, initially resistant to changing her cooking methods, gradually became curious about Brian's approach. "Show me how you make that chicken again," she'd ask, watching intently as he demonstrated simple preparation techniques that didn't rely on butter or breadcrumbs for flavor. The transformation of the Mitchell household was slow and incomplete, but by the time Brian returned to his own apartment, small changes had taken root. His father had walked the neighborhood loop 3 days in a row. His mother had purchased a vegetable steamer. Most significantly, they'd scheduled appointments with a nutritionist and a diabetes educator, acknowledging that their son's path might also be their own salvation. Back in his daily routine, Brian faced a new challenge: maintaining momentum as the dramatic results of early weight loss plateaued. The final 30 pounds proved stubborn, clinging to his frame despite his consistency with diet and exercise. For the first time in months, discouragement crept in, tempting him to restrict more severely or exercise more intensely. Mike recognized the dangerous thinking during one of their now thrice-weekly gym sessions. "That's how people burn out," he cautioned. "The scale isn't the only measure of success." Indeed, Brian's latest blood work had been exceptional. His A1C had dropped to 5.7%, technically below the diabetes threshold, though his endocrinologist warned that the condition was managed, not cured. His blood pressure had normalized, and he no longer needed medication for it. Even his cholesterol levels, once concerningly high, had improved dramatically. The true test came at his company's annual sales conference in Chicago. For 3 days, Brian navigated buffet meals, open bars, and colleagues who hadn't seen his transformation in person. Some barely recognized him. Others seemed oddly uncomfortable with the change, as if his success highlighted their own stagnation. His regional manager, Dave, caught him alone at the hotel gym one morning. "I owe you an apology," he said, surprisingly direct. "When you started this health thing, I thought it was going to distract you from work. I was wrong. Your numbers are better than ever." Brian had smiled, remembering the dismissive comment from months earlier. Turns out feeling good helps you perform better. Who knew? The most meaningful moment came during the awards dinner. Brian, nursing a sparkling water while others indulged in the open bar, found himself seated beside the company's CEO, a formidable woman in her 60s, known for her direct approach. "Mitchell," she said, studying him, "tell me how you did it." For 20 minutes he shared his story, not the sanitized version he usually offered acquaintances, but the raw truth of his diagnosis, his fear, and his daily struggle to rebuild his relationship with food and his body. When he finished, she nodded thoughtfully. "My husband was diagnosed last month. He's where you started." She handed him her card with her personal number written on the back. "He needs to hear this from someone who's been there." That night in his hotel room, Brian stood before the mirror in his new suit, purchased 3 sizes smaller than his previous one. At 175 pounds, he still had progress to make toward his goal weight of 145, but the man looking back at him was unrecognizable from the one who had received a devastating diagnosis nearly a year earlier. His phone buzzed with a text from his father, a photo of the older Mitchell on a walking trail, thumbs up with the caption, "Day 14 streak." Below it was a second message, "Proud of you, son. Thanks for showing me the way." Brian sat on the edge of the hotel bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the journey, not just his physical transformation, but the unexpected ripple effects it had created in the lives around him. The path ahead remained challenging, but for the first time, he wasn't walking it alone. The starting line of the half-marathon stretched across the park entrance, a colorful arch bearing the words, "Diabetes Research Foundation Annual Run." Brian adjusted his race bib, number 140, a coincidence that felt significant, and checked his GPS watch one last time. Around him, hundreds of runners stretched and chatted, creating an atmosphere of nervous excitement. Nervous. Mike appeared beside him, dressed in his own running gear. "Terrified," Brian admitted with a laugh. 13.1 miles seemed a lot more reasonable when I registered 3 months ago. 18 months had passed since his diagnosis. At 145 pounds, exactly 140 pounds less than his starting weight, Brian had reached his target, maintaining it steadily for the past 2 months. His body, once an adversary, had become a partner in his journey, responding to proper nutrition and consistent movement with newfound strength and resilience. The physical transformation had been documented meticulously in medical records, showing his A1C dropping from 9.2% to a stable 4%. In his closet, where clothes had been replaced 4 times to accommodate his shrinking frame, in his endocrinologist's decision 6 months earlier to take him off all diabetes medication, declaring his condition in remission through lifestyle management. But the internal changes defied such neat measurement. How could he quantify the shift from dreading physical activity to craving it? How could he document the freedom of grocery shopping without anxiety, of understanding his hunger cues after decades of ignoring them? The announcer called the runners to their starting positions. Brian and Mike joined the middle of the pack, not elite athletes, but no longer beginners either. "Whatever happens today, you've already won," Mike reminded him as they waited for the starting gun. Brian nodded, thinking of the journey that had led him here. The final 30 pounds had taken nearly as long to lose as the first 110, requiring patience and persistence through plateaus and setbacks. There had been days when the old cravings returned with crushing intensity, when he'd found himself in the parking lot of his former late-night fast food haunts, fighting the pull of familiar comfort. But there had also been breakthroughs, The first time he ran 5 miles continuously, the morning he realized he could easily climb the 5 flights of stairs to his office when the elevator was out of service. The night he cooked a healthy dinner for his parents when they visited, watching with quiet satisfaction as his father asked for the recipe. The starting gun fired, jolting Brian from his reflections. The crowd surged forward, and he found his rhythm, settling into the comfortable pace he and Mike had practiced during their training runs. The course wound through the city he'd called home for 7 years, past landmarks he'd driven by countless times, but never truly seen. 3 miles in, they passed his old apartment building, where the journey had begun with that first tearful night after diagnosis. 5 miles in, they ran alongside the park where he'd attempted his first painful jog, lasting barely 3 minutes before gasping for breath. "Doing okay?" Mike checked in as they reached the water station at mile 7. Brian nodded, surprised to find he was more than okay. He was enjoying himself. The runner's high he'd once thought was mythical had become a familiar friend, a rush of endorphins that made even the difficult miles manageable. As they approached mile 10, Brian spotted a familiar face in the crowd of spectators, Tyler holding a homemade sign reading, "Go Brian." Beside him stood several other friends from Brian's old circle, people he'd gradually reconnected with on new terms over the past year. Their presence was particularly meaningful given the conversation he'd had with Tyler months earlier, when his friend had finally asked the question many seemed afraid to voice. "Do you ever miss your old life?" Brian had considered the question carefully. "I miss the simplicity of not thinking about what I eat," he'd admitted. "I miss the blissful ignorance, but I don't miss feeling sick all the time. I don't miss hating what I saw in the mirror. And I don't miss knowing I was slowly killing myself." The final 3 miles of the half-marathon tested Brian's endurance and resolve. His legs burned, his lungs worked harder, and the voice of doubt, quieter these days but never fully silenced, whispered that he should slow down, that he was attempting too much. Instead, he focused on the rhythm of his breathing, on the steady presence of Mike beside him, on the months of training that had prepared him for this moment. When the finish line came into view, emotion welled up unexpectedly, blurring his vision. "Sprint finish?" Mike suggested with a grin. Together they accelerated for the final stretch, crossing the finish line with arms raised in triumph. Brian's watch showed 2 hours and 12 minutes, not record-breaking by any measure, but a personal victory that would have seemed impossible 18 months earlier. After collecting their medals and recovery snacks, Brian and his small cheering section gathered at a nearby cafe, one he'd researched in advance to ensure it offered options that fit his eating plan. As they celebrated with protein-rich meals and sparkling water toasts, Brian felt a sense of integration that had been missing from the early days of his transformation, when his new lifestyle had seemed at odds with his social connections. "I have news," he announced as the conversation lulled. "I'm starting a coaching certification program next month." The decision had crystallized gradually over recent months, as more colleagues, acquaintances, and even strangers approached him about his transformation. The conversation with his company's CEO had been particularly illuminating. Her husband had indeed called Brian, resulting in ongoing weekly check-ins that had evolved into informal coaching. "I want to help people who are where I was," Brian explained. "Not just with weight loss, but with the whole journey, rebuilding your relationship with food, with your body, with your identity." His friends responded with enthusiasm, but it was Mike's quiet approval that meant the most. "You've been doing this already," his mentor observed. "Now you'll just have the credentials to match your experience." Later that evening, alone in his apartment, a new one, in a building with a fitness center and walking distance to a farmer's market, Brian opened his laptop to update the blog he'd started 6 months into his journey. What had begun as a personal accountability tool had grown into a platform, with a modest but engaged following of others navigating similar health challenges. His half-marathon medal hung beside his desk, catching the light as he typed. The blog post came easily, describing not just the physical achievement of completing the race, but the deeper milestone it represented, the integration of his new lifestyle into a full, connected life that no longer revolved around his health journey, but was immeasurably enhanced by it. As he wrote, Brian reflected on the question that had dogged him throughout his transformation, one that well-meaning doctors, friends, and family had asked repeatedly: what was his secret? How had he succeeded where so many others struggled? There was no secret, of course, no magic formula or shortcut. There had been only the daily decision to choose life over temporary comfort, to build habits that served rather than undermined his well-being, to find meaning beyond the number on the scale. The true transformation Brian had come to understand wasn't physical at all. The weight loss was merely a visible manifestation of a profound internal shift, from a man who lived for immediate gratification to one who found deeper satisfaction in challenging himself, in connecting authentically with others, in contributing to a community of people fighting similar battles. Tomorrow, he would begin training for a full marathon. Next week, he would register for his coaching certification courses. Next month, he would lead his first support group at the local Diabetes Association. The journey wasn't over. It had simply evolved into something richer and more purposeful than he could have imagined that terrifying night of his diagnosis. Brian closed his laptop and glanced at the framed before and after photos on his wall, not with the pride of someone who had conquered a problem, but with the compassion of someone who had integrated all versions of himself into a whole person. The physical transformation was dramatic, but the man in both photos was him. The same heart, the same soul, the same fundamental worth. This understanding was perhaps his greatest achievement, learning that his value had never been tied to his size, his health status, or his physical capabilities. The weight loss had saved his life, but the journey had given him something even more precious. It had taught him how to truly live it.